The morning she walked through those tall iron gates, the sky was gray, and the air smelled like rain. She was 12 years old, wearing shoes that had been worn by someone else before her, and carrying a violin case that had more scratches than shine. Her name was Mei Lin, and she had no idea that this day would change everything. The Hartwell Conservatory was not a place for girls like her. Everyone knew that. It was a place for children whose parents drove expensive cars and lived in houses with more rooms than people. It was a place where kids had been taking private music lessons since they were 4. Where families had connections that went back generations. Mei Lin had none of that. What she had was a mother who worked double shifts at a hotel, a tiny apartment above a laundromat, and a violin her grandmother had found at a pawn shop 3 years ago. But she also had something else. She had a gift. The scholarship letter had arrived on a Tuesday. And her mother had cried for 20 minutes straight. Not sad tears. Happy tears. Proud tears. The kind of tears that come when you realize your daughter might have a chance at a life you could never give her on your own. The conservatory had heard a recording of Mei Lin playing at a local competition. Someone important had listened, and now, against all odds, she was in. She stood in the entrance hall that first morning, looking up at the high ceilings and the paintings on the walls. Everything was so clean, so polished, so quiet. Students walked past her in pressed uniforms, their shoes clicking on the marble floors. They carried instrument cases that looked brand new. They laughed and talked like they owned the place. Because in a way, they did. Nobody talked to her. She found her way to the main practice room, where students were warming up before the first class. The moment she walked in, the room went silent. Not completely silent, but that kind of quiet where you know people are looking at you and pretending not to. She felt their eyes on her worn shoes, her second-hand uniform that didn't quite fit right, her old violin case held together with tape in one corner. A boy near the window whispered something to his friend. They both laughed. Mei Lin pretended not to hear. She found an empty chair in the back corner and sat down, keeping her eyes on the floor. The first week was hard. The second week was harder. It wasn't just that the other students ignored her. It was the way they ignored her. Like she was invisible. Like she didn't matter. When groups formed for practice sessions, no one picked her. When students chatted during breaks, conversations stopped when she came near. She ate lunch alone every single day, sitting on a bench outside where no one could see her. But the worst part was the teachers. She had expected the students to be cruel. Kids could be mean, especially rich kids who had never met someone like her. But she had hoped the teachers would be different. She had hoped they would see her talent, not her background. She was wrong. Her main instructor was a man named Professor Aldridge. He was tall and thin, with gray hair and cold eyes that seemed to look right through her. He had been teaching at Hartwell for over 30 years, and he had very clear ideas about who deserved to be there and who did not. On her first day in his class, he asked her where she had studied before. "I taught myself mostly," she said, "from videos online. And my grandmother showed me some things." The room went quiet. Professor Aldridge raised one eyebrow. "You taught yourself," he repeated slowly, like the words tasted bad in his mouth. "From videos." Some students snickered. Mei Lin felt her face grow hot. "Well," the professor said, "let's see what the internet has taught you. Play something." She stood up, her heart pounding. She opened her violin case and took out her grandmother's old instrument. It was nothing special to look at. The wood was dull, and one of the tuning pegs had been replaced with a mismatched one. But when she placed it under her chin, it felt like home. She played a piece by Bach. It was a piece she had practiced 1,000 times in her small bedroom, with the sound of washing machines rumbling through the floor below. She played it with her eyes closed, letting the music carry her away from this cold room and these cold people. When she finished, she opened her eyes. Professor Aldridge's face showed nothing. No surprise. No approval. Nothing. "Adequate," he said finally. "But you have much to learn. Real musicians are not made from YouTube tutorials. They are shaped by proper instruction, proper environment, proper breeding. Proper breeding. Like she was a horse or a dog. She sat back down, her hands shaking. She would not cry. she would not give them that satisfaction. The weeks that followed were a constant battle. Every time she improved, Professor Aldridge found something new to criticize. Her posture was wrong. Her technique was sloppy. Her interpretation lacked sophistication. It didn't matter that she practiced longer and harder than anyone else in the class. It didn't matter that she stayed late in the practice rooms until the janitor had to ask her to leave. Nothing she did was ever good enough. Meanwhile, students with half her talent received praise and encouragement. A boy who could barely hold his bow correctly was told he had potential. A girl who played the same wrong note 3 times in a row was told she was showing improvement. But Mei Lin, who played flawlessly, was told she was adequate. She started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe talent wasn't enough. Maybe there was something missing inside her. Something that couldn't be taught or practiced. Something you had to be born with. Something you had to be born into. One night, she sat alone in her room, staring at her violin. The laundromat below had closed for the night, and the building was quiet. Her mother was still at work. Wouldn't be home for hours. She thought about quitting. Just packing up her things and going back to her old school, where nobody expected anything from her. Where nobody looked at her like she was a mistake. It would be easier, so much easier. But then she remembered her grandmother's face when she first put that violin in her hands. The way her eyes had lit up, the way her voice had trembled when she said, "This belonged to someone special. Now it belongs to you." Her grandmother had never told her the full story of that violin, just that it had been in the family once, a long time ago, and had been lost and found again. But Mei Lin could feel the history in it every time she played. She could feel the weight of all the hands that had held it before her. She picked up the violin and began to play. Softly at first, then louder. She played until her fingers hurt. She played until tears ran down her face. She played until she remembered why she was here, not for the professors, not for the other students, not even for herself. She was here for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. She was here to prove them all wrong. She just didn't know yet how hard they would try to stop her. 3 months passed, and something unexpected happened. Mei Lin got better. Not just a little better. She got so good that people started to notice. It began in small ways. During group practice, other students would glance over when she played. Some of them tried to hide it, pretending to adjust their music stands or check their phones, but she could feel their eyes on her. She could feel the shift in the room whenever she picked up her bow. Then came the first real moment. A weekly performance class where students played in front of each other. A girl named Wei Ting had just finished a complicated piece, and everyone clapped politely. Professor Aldridge nodded with approval and made some encouraging comments about her dynamics and phrasing. Then it was Mei Lin's turn. She had chosen the same piece. Not to compete, but because she genuinely loved it. She had been practicing it for weeks, late at night, when the building was empty and no one could hear her. She played it differently than Wei Ting. Where Wei Ting had been technically correct, Mei Lin was something else. She played like the music was coming from somewhere deep inside her, like every note meant something. Like she was telling a story that only she knew. When she finished, the room was silent. Not the usual awkward silence that followed her performances. This was different. This was the silence of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Even Professor Aldridge seemed caught off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then simply said, "Next." That was all. No feedback. No criticism. Nothing. But Mei Lin saw something flicker across his face. Just for a second. It looked almost like fear. After that day, things changed. The other students still didn't talk to her. But the mocking stopped. The whispers turned into something else. Respect, maybe. Or jealousy. She couldn't tell which. What she could tell was that Professor Aldridge had started watching her more closely. Not in a good way. He would stare at her during class with narrowed eyes. Like she was a problem he needed to solve. She tried not to think about it. She focused on her music, on getting better, on proving that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. But deep down, she knew something was coming. She could feel it the way you feel a storm before the first drop of rain. The faculty meeting happened on a Thursday evening. Mei Lin didn't know about it, of course. She was in practice room 7, working on a difficult passage that had been giving her trouble. The building was mostly empty. The sound of her violin echoed through the hallway, but there was no one around to hear it. 3 floors up, in a room with heavy wooden doors and portraits of famous musicians on the walls, the teachers of Hartwell Conservatory were having a conversation about her. Professor Aldridge had called the meeting himself. He sat at the head of the long table, his hands folded in front of him, his face serious. "We have a problem," he said. The other teachers looked at each other. Some of them already knew what this was about. Others waited quietly. "The scholarship student," Professor Aldridge continued. "The Chen girl. She's becoming disruptive." An older woman named Professor Huang raised her eyebrows. "Disruptive? Her grades are excellent. Her attendance is perfect. I've never seen a student practice as much as she does." "That's precisely the problem," Professor Aldridge said. "She's making the other students uncomfortable. They come from established families. They have expectations. How do you think it looks when a girl with no background, no training, no proper instruction, outperforms children who have been studying since birth?" Professor Huang frowned. "It looks like talent. It looks like a fluke." Professor Aldridge snapped. "And flukes don't last. The question is how much damage she does before she burns out." He paused and looked around the room. "I think we need to accelerate that process." A younger teacher at the end of the table shifted in his seat. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Professor Aldridge smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The midterm evaluations are coming up. Every student must perform a piece assigned by their instructor. I propose we give Miss Chen something special." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside was sheet music, old and yellowed at the edges. He slid it across the table so the others could see. "Paganini," someone whispered. "Caprice number 24. Professor Huang's face went pale. "You can't be serious. That piece is reserved for final year students. Even then, most of them struggle with it. She's 12 years old." "Exactly," Professor Aldridge said. "If she fails, which she will, it proves what I've been saying all along. She doesn't have the foundation. She doesn't have the training. She got lucky with a few simple pieces, but she's not ready for real music." "And her scholarship?" Professor Huang asked. "Will be reviewed based on her performance. If she fails the midterm evaluation, the board will have no choice but to reconsider her placement." He leaned back in his chair. "It's not personal. It's about maintaining standards." The room was quiet for a long moment. Some teachers looked down at the table. Others stared at the sheet music like it was a weapon. Finally, a voice spoke up. A man named Professor Xu, who taught music theory and rarely said much in meetings. "Has anyone here actually listened to her play? Really listened?" Professor Aldridge's eyes hardened. "I've heard enough." "I don't think you have," Professor Xu said quietly. "I walked by the practice rooms last week. She was playing something I didn't recognize. I stopped outside the door and listened for 20 minutes. In 30 years of teaching, I have never heard anything like it." "Emotion is not the same as skill," Professor Aldridge said dismissively. "No," Professor Xu agreed. "But she has both. And you know it. That's why we're really here. Isn't it?" The two men stared at each other across the table. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. In the end, it didn't matter what Professor Xu thought. Professor Aldridge had seniority. He had connections. He had the ear of the school's director. When the vote was called, only Professor Xu and Professor Huang opposed the plan. Everyone else went along with it, some reluctantly, some without hesitation. The decision was made. The next morning, Mei Lin was called to Professor Aldridge's office. She walked in, expecting another lecture about her technique, or her posture, or some other flaw he had invented. Instead, he handed her a folder with a thin smile. "Your midterm piece," he said. "I think you'll find it challenging." She opened the folder and looked at the music. At first, She didn't understand what she was seeing. The notes were so densely packed on the page that they looked like black rain. She had never seen anything so complicated in her life. Paganini, Professor Aldridge said, watching her face carefully. Caprice. Number 24. It's one of the most difficult pieces ever written for violin. I'm sure you've heard of it. She had heard of it. Every violinist had. It was legendary. It was also supposed to be impossible for someone her age. You have 2 weeks, he continued. If you can play it at the evaluation, you pass. If you can't. He let the sentence hang in the air. She looked up at him. His eyes were cold, satisfied. He thought he had already won. Thank you for the opportunity, she said quietly. Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Maybe. He had expected her to argue, to complain, to cry. Instead, she just took the music, turned around, and walked out of his office. She made it all the way to the bathroom before her hands started shaking. She locked herself in a stall and stared at the sheet music through blurry eyes. 2 weeks. 14 days to learn something that took most people years. They wanted her to fail. They had designed this whole thing to make her fail. And the worst part was, they would probably succeed. She thought about her mother, working night shifts to pay for her uniform and supplies. She thought about her grandmother, saving every spare coin for years to buy that pawnshop violin. She thought about all the sacrifices that had been made to get her here. She couldn't let them down. But she also couldn't see how she would survive this. For the first time since she arrived at Hartwell, Mei Lin felt truly alone. The first night, she didn't sleep at all. She sat on her bed, with the sheet music spread out in front of her, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. The notes climbed up and down the page, like tiny black insects. There were passages that required fingers to move faster than she thought possible. There were jumps between strings that seemed designed to make the player fail. Every time she thought she understood a section, she would turn the page and find something even more difficult. By the time the sun came up, her eyes were burning and her head was pounding. But she had memorized the first page. Just the first page. 13 more to go. She went to school that day like a ghost. She sat through her classes without hearing a word. Her body was present, but her mind was somewhere else, running through the notes over and over again. During lunch, she skipped eating and went straight to the practice room. She had exactly 45 minutes before afternoon classes. She used every second. That became her routine for the next 2 weeks. She woke up at 5 in the morning and practiced until it was time to leave for school. She practiced during lunch. She practiced after classes ended, staying in the building until the janitor made his rounds at 9 o'clock. Then she went home and practiced more, until her mother came back from work and forced her to stop. "You need to eat," her mother would say, standing in the doorway with worried eyes. "I will," Mei Lin would answer. But soon never came. There was always another passage to work on. Another section that wasn't quite right. The music haunted her, even when she wasn't playing. She heard it in her dreams. She heard it when she walked down the street. She heard it in the rhythm of the washing machines rumbling beneath her bedroom floor. By the end of the first week, she could play the piece at half speed. That might sound like progress, but it wasn't enough. Not even close. The evaluation required full tempo. Anything less would be considered a failure. Her fingers started to hurt. Not the normal kind of soreness that comes from practice, but a deep, throbbing pain that wouldn't go away. She looked at her hands one night and saw that her fingertips were raw and red. Small cracks had formed in the skin. When she pressed down on the strings, it felt like touching fire. She kept playing anyway. Her shoulder began to ache from holding the violin for so many hours. Her neck was stiff. Her back hurt. She started getting headaches that lasted all day. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to the evaluation, and she still wasn't ready. The other students noticed something was wrong. She looked tired all the time now, with dark circles under her eyes and a pale, exhausted face. Some of them whispered about it. A few even seemed concerned. though none of them said anything to her directly. Professor Aldridge noticed too. During class, he would glance at her with a small, satisfied smile. He could see what his assignment was doing to her. He was enjoying it. On the 10th day, something broke. She was in practice room 7, working on the most difficult passage in the entire piece. It was a section near the end, where the notes came so fast and so close together that they blurred into a single stream of sound. She had tried it 100 times, 200 times. She couldn't get it right. Her fingers slipped. The bow scratched across the strings, making an ugly, screeching sound. She tried again. Slipped again. The screech was even worse. She threw the bow across the room. It clattered against the wall and fell to the floor. She stood there, breathing hard, her whole body shaking. Then she sank down onto the chair and put her face in her hands. She couldn't do this. It was impossible. They had given her something impossible on purpose, and she had been foolish enough to think she could beat it. But she couldn't. She was just a girl from a poor family with a second-hand violin and dreams that were too big for someone like her. The tears came then. She cried quietly at first, then harder, until her shoulders were shaking and her breath came in ragged gasps. She cried for all the nights she had spent practicing alone. She cried for her mother, working double shifts. She cried for every time someone had looked at her like she didn't belong. She cried until there was nothing left. When she finally stopped, the practice room was dark. The sun had set without her noticing. She sat in the shadows for a long time, not moving, not thinking. Just empty. Then she picked up her phone and called her grandmother. It was late, almost 10 o'clock, but her grandmother answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm and familiar, like a blanket on a cold night. "Little one," she said. "What's wrong?" Mei Lin tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and broken. The piece. The evaluation. The teachers who wanted her to fail, everything poured out of her in a rush, and by the end, she was crying again. Her grandmother listened without interrupting. When Mei Lin finally went quiet, there was a long pause. "Let me tell you something," her grandmother said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, heavier, like she was carrying something that had been weighing on her for years. "That violin you're holding, it belonged to my mother, your great-grandmother." Mei Lin looked down at the instrument in her lap. The dull wood, the mismatched tuning peg. She had always known it was old, but she had never asked where it came from. "She was a musician," her grandmother continued. "A real one. Better than anyone in her village, maybe better than anyone in the whole province. But she was born in a time when women weren't allowed to perform. Music was for men. Women were supposed to stay home, stay quiet, stay invisible." Her grandmother's voice cracked slightly. She played anyway, in secret, late at night, when everyone else was asleep. She would go out to the fields and play under the stars, where no one could hear her. Mei Lin closed her eyes and imagined it. A woman alone in a dark field, playing music that no one would ever hear. One day, a man came to the village. A music teacher from the city. He heard her playing and told her she had a gift. He said he could get her into a conservatory, help her become the musician she was meant to be. "What happened?" Mei Lin whispered. Her father found out. He was ashamed that his daughter had been sneaking around, playing music like a man. He took her violin and sold it, told her she was never to play again. Her grandmother paused. She never did. She got married, had children, lived a quiet life. But something in her died that day. I could see it in her eyes. Even when I was a little girl. A sadness that never went away. The violin. I found it years later, in a pawn shop in the city. I don't know how it got there. Maybe it passed through a dozen hands before I saw it. But the moment I picked it up, I knew it was hers. Her grandmother's voice was thick with emotion. I bought it with every coin I had saved. And I kept it, waiting for the right person to give it to. Mei Lin was crying again. But these were different tears. Not tears of defeat. Something else. She never got her moment, her grandmother said. She never got to stand on a stage and show the world what she could do, but she always believed that someone in our family would. She told me that, before she died. She said, "Someday, one of us will play for all of us." The line was quiet for a moment. Then her grandmother spoke again, her voice fierce and strong. "You are not playing for those teachers, little one. You are not playing for that school. You are playing for her. For me. For every woman who was ever told she wasn't allowed to have dreams." Mei Lin looked at the violin in her hands. The old, scratched, beautiful violin that had traveled through decades and across miles to find its way to her. "I don't know if I can do this," she said quietly. "You can," her grandmother said. "Because you are not alone. You never have been." After they hung up, Mei Lin sat in the dark practice room for a long time. Then she stood up, walked across the room, and picked up her bow from where it had fallen. She had 4 days left. She started playing. The morning of the evaluation, Mei Lin woke up before the sun. She lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. Her fingers were wrapped in bandages, her shoulder still ached. But something had changed in the last 4 days. Something inside her had shifted. After her grandmother's phone call, she had practiced differently. Not with desperation, but with purpose. Every note meant something now. Every passage carried the weight of generations. She wasn't just learning a piece of music. She was carrying forward a dream that had been waiting almost 100 years to be heard. She got out of bed and walked to the window. The sky was just starting to turn pink at the edges. Somewhere out there, her grandmother was probably awake too, thinking about her. Her mother appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work. She looked at Mei Lin with soft, worried eyes. "How do you feel?" Mei Lin thought about it. Scared. Tired. Nervous. But also something else. Something she couldn't quite name. "Ready," she said. Her mother crossed the room and hugged her tight. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Everything she wanted to say was in that hug. When Mei Lin arrived at school, the hallways were buzzing. Word had spread about her assignment. Everyone knew what Professor Aldridge had done. Some students thought it was unfair, others thought it was hilarious. Most of them were just curious to see what would happen. The evaluation was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main performance hall. It was the biggest room in the conservatory, with tall windows and a high ceiling, and rows of velvet seats that could hold 300 people. Usually, midterm evaluations were small, private affairs. But Professor Aldridge had made sure this one was different. He had invited everyone. By the time Mei Lin arrived at the hall, the seats were already filling up. Students poured in from every department. Teachers stood along the walls. Even staff members who never attended performances had come to watch. It felt less like an evaluation and more like an execution. She stood backstage, listening to the noise of the crowd through the heavy curtain. Her violin case was in her hands. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. A door opened behind her. She turned and saw Professor Xu, the quiet teacher who had defended her in the faculty meeting. She didn't know that, of course. But she had always sensed that he was different from the others. He walked over to her and stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of cloth. "For your bow," he said quietly. "It helps with the grip." She took it from him. It was soft and worn, like it had been used many times before. "I've been teaching for 30 years, he said. "I've seen hundreds of students come through these doors. Some of them were talented. A few were exceptional." He paused and looked at her with serious eyes. "But I've never seen anyone like you." She didn't know what to say. No one at this school had ever spoken to her like that. "What they did to you was wrong," he continued. "But don't let them see your anger. Don't let them see your fear. Just play." He put a hand on her shoulder. "Play like no one is watching. Play like your life depends on it. Because in a way, it does." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing through the door without looking back. Mei Lin stood alone in the dim backstage area, holding the small cloth in her hand. She wrapped it around her bow, feeling the texture against her fingers. A voice came over the speaker. Her name, her turn. She took a deep breath, picked up her violin, and walked toward the stage. The lights were blinding. She couldn't see the faces in the audience, but she could feel them. Hundreds of eyes, all fixed on her. The room was completely silent. She walked to the center of the stage. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. She was wearing a simple black dress that her mother had sewn by hand, staying up late for 3 nights to finish it. Her shoes were still secondhand. Her violin was still old and scratched, but she had never felt more powerful in her life. She saw Professor Aldridge in the front row. He was sitting with his arms crossed and a small smile on his face. The smile of someone who already knew how this story would end. She looked away from him. He didn't matter. None of them mattered. She closed her eyes and thought about her great-grandmother. A woman she had never met, standing alone in a dark field, playing music that no one would ever hear. A woman whose dreams had been stolen, whose voice had been silenced, whose gift had been buried for almost a century. Not anymore. She raised her violin to her shoulder. She placed the bow on the strings. She took one last breath, and then she played. The first notes filled the hall like water rushing through a broken dam. Fast and fierce and full of fire. The audience shifted in their seats. This was not what they had expected. Most students, when attempting a piece this difficult, played it safe. They slowed down in the hard parts. They simplified the complicated passages. They did whatever they could to get through it without making mistakes. Maylin did none of that. She played at full speed from the very first note. Her fingers flew across the strings so fast they blurred. The bow danced and jumped and sliced through the air like it was alive. She didn't hold back. She didn't play it safe. She threw herself into the music like she was falling off a cliff. The second movement came, even harder than the first. Notes piled on top of notes. Passages that would make a grown musician weep. She attacked them without hesitation, without fear. Her eyes were still closed. Her body swayed with the rhythm. She was somewhere else now, somewhere far away from this hall, and these people, and everything they thought they knew about her. Somewhere in the audience, a student gasped. Then, another. The whispers started. Soft at first, then louder. People were leaning forward in their seats. Teachers were exchanging glances. Something was happening that none of them had prepared for. She wasn't just playing the piece. She was owning it. The third movement arrived, and with it the impossible passage. The one that had broken her in the practice room. The one that had made her throw her bow against the wall. It came rushing toward her like a wave. And for one terrible second, her fingers hesitated. Then she heard her grandmother's voice in her head. "You are not alone. You never have been." Her fingers found the notes. Every single one. Fast and clean and perfect. She tore through the passage like it was nothing. Like it was a song she had known her whole life. Like it had been written into her blood. The final movement now. The hardest part of all. A cascade of notes so dense and so fast that most violinists couldn't even read them, let alone play them. She felt her muscles burning. She felt sweat on her forehead. She felt the bandages on her fingers starting to slip. She didn't care. She played harder, faster, louder. She played like her great-grandmother was standing beside her, guiding her hands. She played like every woman who had ever been silenced was right there in that hall, watching and waiting and hoping. The final notes came, a series of rapid-fire sounds that built and built and built until they reached the highest point, the impossible peak, the moment where everything came together. She hit it perfectly. The last note rang out through the hall, hanging in the air like a bell that had been struck. Then, silence. Complete and total silence. Maylin opened her eyes. She was breathing hard. Her arms were shaking. Her fingers were throbbing with pain. She looked out at the audience. And then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. One person. Then 2. Then 10. Then 50. Then the whole room exploded. People were standing up. People were cheering. Students who had mocked her were on their feet, clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. The applause rolled over her like a wave. It went on, and on, and on, filling every corner of the hall, shaking the windows, drowning out everything else. She looked at Professor Aldridge. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He was just sitting there, frozen, his face pale, and his eyes wide. He looked like a man who had just watched his whole world crumble. Mei Lin didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just stood there, holding her grandmother's violin, letting the applause wash over her. She had done it. Against all odds, against everyone who had tried to stop her. Against a system designed to make her fail. She had done the impossible. But she wasn't finished yet. The applause lasted for 3 full minutes. Mei Lin stood at the center of the stage, her violin at her side, watching the crowd rise to their feet. Students who had never spoken a word to her were now cheering like she was a hero. Teachers who had doubted her were clapping with stunned expressions on their faces. Even the staff members by the doors were applauding. But there was one person who wasn't clapping. Professor Aldridge sat in his seat like a statue. His arms were still crossed. His face had gone from pale to something darker. Something harder. He looked like a man trying to hold together a wall that was already falling apart. The applause finally began to fade. People started to sit back down, still buzzing with excitement, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. A few students pulled out their phones, tapping away at screens, already sharing what had happened. Mei Lin didn't move. She stood there at the edge of the stage, looking out at the audience. Her heart was still pounding. Her fingers were still aching. But there was something she needed to do. Something she had thought about during those long nights of practice, during those moments when she wanted to give up, during that phone call with her grandmother. She took a step forward, then another. She walked to the very front of the stage, where a small microphone stood on a thin metal stand. It was meant for announcements, not performances, but she reached out and adjusted it anyway. The room went quiet again. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, but in the silence, everyone could hear her. "Thank you for listening." She paused and took a breath. Her eyes found Professor Aldridge in the front row. He was staring at her with cold, hard eyes. "I know why I was given this piece," she continued. "I know it wasn't meant to help me. It was meant to break me." A ripple went through the audience. Whispers, shifting seats, uncomfortable glances. "I'm not saying this to complain. I'm not saying this to make anyone feel bad." She held up her violin, the old scratched instrument that had traveled through so many years to reach her. "I'm saying this because someone needs to hear it." She looked around the room, at all the young faces watching her. "Some of you come from families with money. Some of you have had the best teachers and the best instruments since you were little kids. That's not your fault. That's just how life is." She paused. "But some of you are like me. Some of you come from nothing. Some of you have been told your whole lives that you don't belong in places like this, that you're not good enough, that dreams are for other people." The room was completely silent now, not even a whisper. "I want you to know something," Mei Lin said. "They're wrong. Whoever told you that, they're wrong. Because talent doesn't care where you come from. Hard work doesn't care how much money your parents have. Music doesn't care what kind of shoes you're wearing." She looked directly at Professor Aldridge. "And no one gets to decide your future except you." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, someone started clapping again. A single person. Then more joined in. The applause built and built, until it was even louder than before. Professor Aldridge stood up abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with an ugly sound. Without looking at anyone, he walked down the aisle and pushed through the doors at the back of the hall. They slammed shut behind him. No one went after him. The days that followed were strange and wonderful. News of Mei Lin's performance spread faster than anyone expected. The students who had recorded it on their phones posted it online, and within hours, thousands of people had watched it. Then tens of thousands. Then more. Comments poured in from around the world. People who had never heard of Hartwell Conservatory, who had never heard of Mei Lin, were watching this 12-year-old girl play an impossible piece of music and weeping at their screens. By the end of the week, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. News reporters showed up at the school. They wanted interviews, photos, statements. The school's director, who had never paid attention to Mei Lin before, suddenly wanted to shake her hand and take pictures with her. He talked about how proud the conservatory was of its scholarship program, how they had always believed in giving opportunities to talented students from all backgrounds. Mei Lin smiled politely and said nothing. She knew the truth. So did everyone else. Professor Aldridge didn't come back to school for 5 days. When he finally returned, he looked older somehow. Smaller. The confidence that had always surrounded him like armor was gone. He taught his classes quietly, without the sharp comments and cruel smiles that had defined him before. A few weeks later, the school announced that he would be retiring at the end of the semester. They said it was his decision. They said he wanted to spend more time with his family. But everyone knew the real reason. He had tried to destroy a little girl's dream. And instead, she had destroyed his reputation. Mei Lin didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She had never wanted revenge. She had only wanted a chance. Invitations started arriving. Music programs around the world reached out to her. Orchestras offered her spots in their youth ensembles. Prestigious teachers wanted to give her lessons for free. Her mother cried again when she saw the letters, but this time she laughed too, shaking her head in disbelief. "My daughter," she kept saying. "My daughter." Mei Lin's grandmother came to visit a week after the performance. She took a long bus ride from her small town, carrying a bag of homemade food and a smile that could light up a room. When Mei Lin hugged her, she felt the old woman's hands trembling. "You did it," her grandmother whispered. "You played for all of us." They sat together in the small apartment above the laundromat, eating dumplings and talking for hours. Mei Lin played the Paganini piece again, just for her grandmother. This time, she played it slowly, softly, letting each note breathe. Her grandmother listened with closed eyes and tears running down her cheeks. She would be so proud, she said when the music ended. So proud. 3 months after the performance, Mei Lin received a letter. It wasn't from a music school or an orchestra or a famous teacher. It was handwritten on lined paper, the kind that comes from a school notebook. The return address was from a small town, hundreds of miles away. She opened it and read, "Dear Mei Lin, my name is Xiao Wen. I'm 11 years old. I live in a small village where there are no music teachers and no one plays violin. But I saw your video. I watched it 23 times. I told my mother I wanted to learn violin. She said we couldn't afford one. But I've started saving my allowance. Every week, I put a few coins in a jar. My mother says it will take years to save enough. That's okay. I can wait. I just wanted to say thank you. Before I saw you play, I thought music was only for rich kids in big cities. Now, I know that's not true. When I finally get my violin, I'm going to practice every day. And someday, I'm going to stand on a stage like you did. Thank you for showing me it's possible." Xiao Wen. Mei Lin sat at her desk for a long time, holding the letter. The paper was thin and slightly crumpled, like it had been folded and unfolded many times before being sent. She thought about herself at 11 years old. She thought about the pawn shop violin and the videos she watched online and all the nights she spent practicing alone. She thought about how impossible everything had seemed. Then she picked up a pen and started writing back. She wrote for an hour, filling page after page with everything she wished someone had told her when she was starting out. She wrote about practice and patience and never giving up. She wrote about the hard days and the lonely nights and how it all meant something in the end. And at the bottom of the letter, she added one more thing. She asked for Xiao Wen's address and shoe size, because somewhere in a small village, hundreds of miles away, there was a girl with a jar full of coins and a dream that was too big to fit inside her tiny room. And Mei Lin knew exactly how that felt. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at Xiao Wen's door. Inside was a brand new violin, a book of beginner lessons, and a note that said, "Your story is just beginning. Play for all of us." The jar of coins stayed on Xiao Wen's shelf for years after that. She never spent it. It reminded her that sometimes, when you least expect it, the world sends you exactly what you need. And sometimes, you become that gift for someone else.